On air.
You
Oh,
forgot. We are
didn't even
now
know that.
on air. 3, 2, 1.
This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Gerald.
I'm Maya.
And I'm Anais. Gerald's back!
Yay! Gerald's back! You know what? I really
Hey!
wanted to have like confetti. Gerald, tell us all about your adventure.
Thank you for that lovely welcome. It seems like it's been months, and it actually has.
Actually, it has.
I know. Well, we have this motorhome which is like an RV only smaller, and we travel to France. We travelled to some islands off the west coast. We sat around a bit, we read a bit, we tootled here and there. So we had a pretty good time, and I caught a bit of sun, so that's good.
I am so jealous.
I saw these
Oh, yeah.
pictures on Facebook of your dog in different amazing settings. And I was like, why not me? Can I be the pet? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, let's not go there. It's
We love you, Gerald.
And a dog bed.
yes,
And a carrier.
yes.
Eddie's moving along. Nothing to
have
see
to-
here.
You have to sleep on the floor, but anyway. So,
I
so
thought
yeah,
I
it
was
was.
a pervert.
Yeah.
I think we lost Eddie's. I think she died. So, Gerald, why don't you tell us about the books that you read while you were gone?
Wow. Well, it was pretty much easy reading. It was very. I don't think I wrote any. I read any literary fiction, I'm afraid, but I sort of don't really. I don't know. I don't really feel like doing that on holiday. I like to sort of pick up a book and put it down. Um, so I read a lot of self-published authors and proper published authors. A lot of crime stories mainly. That's. I read Raymond Chandler, which is something I'd never done before. That was cool.
That's excellent.
Yeah. So yeah, I read some good books. So I was very
That
pleased.
sounds like a blast. It looks like Anais is still gone. So let me go ahead and give you guys our typical beginning of the podcast warning. We normally aren't that bad, but sometimes we do get a little bit saucy with our language. So if you want to share the podcast with your children, I suggest looking at both the iTunes reviews. Excuse me. Let me restart this because I can cut it now that I have Audition because Audition
Oh.
rules. Okay, before we get any deeper, listeners should know that sometimes we get a little saucy in our discussions. If we do slip into potty mouth, we will let you know both in the iTunes store and in the show notes. Usually I put the rating in bright red at the very beginning of the show notes, and that way you know which episode you can share with your kids and which ones you can't.
Okay. Shall I wait for Anais to come back in? Or
No, just go ahead
Okay.
because the next part's you anyway.
Okie dokie. If you haven't read In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson Is Buried yet and don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, and then come back. The narrator, a young woman in her 20s, visits her best friend in a California hospital. Her friend is dying, and it has taken the narrator months to drum up the courage to face this fact and pay a visit in person. During the visit, they talk about inconsequential, easy things, but then her friend says that there is a real and present need for someone to be there in the end, help with the final act if necessary. The doctor asks the visitor to give them privacy while he treats the patient, and the narrator goes to the beach. When she returns, there is a second bed in the room, and the narrator knows it is meant for her, so that she can keep vigil. The women nap, and when they wake up, the narrator announces that she must leave now. The sick friend, distressed, storms out feebly and hides in a closet, where nurses join her to soothe her. The narrator leaves, dreams about drinks and shrimp in Malibu, and reflects on the language of grief.
Well, now that's depressing.
After the happy Gerald section.
Wow, we went right from this is awesome, we miss Gerald too, let's all be depressed and kill ourselves in the
Why?
space of 5 seconds.
Anais is back.
Hi, Eddie.
Don't
He
die.
just did the summary and we're all depressed now.
Oh.
Sorry.
So let's start top level. How did everybody feel about the story?
Wow, I knew as soon as I started reading it that the language and the way it was written, I thought I'm going to like this story, and I suppose I did, and I didn't. So we'll get into the discussion later
Ooh,
on.
this is going to be an interesting discussion. How about you, Anais?
So, okay, I'm going to start with the overarching. I like it. I like it a lot, but I had to work to like it, which I'm interested, which I want to discuss.
I loved it. It was depressing, and there are a lot of stories about death, and so I felt like maybe it was slightly cliched topic, but these are topics that are important, and they're cliched for a reason. We need to go over them over and over again as humans. And so I really, really enjoyed the language. Like you said, there were so many nuggets to the story that I just instantly fell in love with. And it was a very visual story for me, but not visual in the typical show, not tell. She was able to tell in a way that was visual, which is something that, like, I would love to learn how to do that. Like, to me, that was the most amazing part of this story.
Yeah, I think so. I think the way it was written was really good, and it was a lot of it was sort of exposition. This happened, then that happened, and we talked about this, but there's so much detail behind the basic information about what's happening, and the pacing I thought was great, and you sort of knew where it was going and what would happen, but the journey getting there was nice. The ending, wasn't so nice and a bit sad and depressing, but I loved reading the story. I really enjoyed their sort of and the way that the writer used the sort of the inconsequential facts. I loved those, and because
Yeah.
She didn't want anything that she'd have to remember. I thought that was very, very good.
Definitely. Anais, what parts of the story did you like the most?
I was going to say the little inconsequential banter, the anecdotes, I thought were very cleverly chosen because every single anecdote was sort of cushioned with where you were supposed to be emotionally or where the narrator was emotionally. So, like, the story would very nicely help amplify, the way that she would try to excuse or justify the fact that she's been absent or the fear that she has in confronting this death or avoiding it altogether. So I thought that was very cleverly done. And then on the second read-through, when I saw even more clearly how she was sort of linking the emotional arc to the anecdotes, I did a little applause.
It's always great when you give it a little applause for the writer in your head. How about for you, Gerald? Was there anything aside from the language that really struck you?
I think the way that the narrator, the friend, she sort of felt guilty for not having visited more, but it sort of didn't matter, and I thought that was because I had something like this some years ago where I felt guilt and I was trying to sort of sort it out in my head, and once you sort it out in your head, then you can sort of assuage yourself of the guilt. You can get rid of the guilt, and I think that she did that very well. That she was there at the end, and she provided what her friend needed. So I like that particularly.
For me, I was in love with the language. I loved every bit of story I'm going to like, and it really brought home the importance of a first sentence, because that first sentence was such a power shot, and it just instantly brought me right into the story and wouldn't let me go. And then the anecdotes were very interesting. They didn't only place where she was emotionally, but they also gave you a lot of information. Like, there was one anecdote where she was saying how when she looked out the window, outside the window was fear, which is a reflection on her own emotions. But then she proceeds to say, sand sharks, in the ocean. Well, sand sharks aren't deadly. So she had to not be native to the area to be afraid of sand sharks, because sand sharks aren't the ones that are going to bite you usually. And so, like, a lot of those anecdotes told me not only a lot about where she was emotionally, but also kind of filled in her personality and her emotions and who she was as a person and who they were as a couple. And one thing that struck me that I really had to work on was I was constantly trying to figure out what was the relationship of these two women together. Were they friends? Were they lovers? How old were they? Because at some points they sounded almost like they could be young and maybe she was dying early. But then, you know, when you find out what year she went into college, okay, that puts her in her 60s. And so there was a little bit of confusion there for me as far as when does this take place? How old are these women? Are they just friends? Is this her girlfriend? You know, there was a little bit of confusion for that for me during the first read. But it wasn't a huge confusion. It was actually a confusion that made me want to read more to figure it out. You know what I mean, Gerald?
Yeah.
It was one of those things where it's like, okay, I need to keep reading. Wow, what's going on here? I don't quite understand. And it like reels you in like a fish on a line is how I felt. I wrote down so many different things about the story where they never came out and said what she was dying of, but she's in isolation. So that's probably cancer, you know, because after having bone marrow transplants and stuff like that, you're in isolation. You know, just little things like that. I like that. I often get frustrated when a story bangs me over the head with facts. And I appreciate a story that makes me work a little bit to figure out what's going on, but not so much that I'm lost.
Yeah, I think that it was yeah, you're right. That first sentence, you sort of think, what's going on here? You're just straight in there, and yeah, I was trying to place what the relationship was, how old they were when it was happening, the same as you, but it didn't bother me at all that because I thought it'll be, I'll discover it later on. I won't be told it with a sledgehammer. I'll discover it, and that will add to the enjoyment. So yeah, so that was.
Ooh, and that leads to a great conversation about trust in the author and how you can establish that early. Because like you, I had that sense that, oh, I'll figure it out right away. And I think it was because of how well the beginning was written that I was able to set down my mean reader and just open up and completely trust the author. Yeah. Is Anais frozen?
No, I'm here.
Okay, just checking.
I think you're right. You can tell within a few sentences whether you're going to enjoy the book and the writing or whether you're not. And it's the same with some of the books that I opened up when I was away. And there's one particular author I discovered that as soon as I started reading, I'd not heard of her before, and I thought this is going to be good, and it was. And so yeah, I trusted the author to not to leave me hanging and not to leave me with questions about the sort of basic setup of the story.
How about you, Anais?
So as I was listening to you guys talk, there was two things that struck me. One was that, and this might just be me projecting, but when I read it, I never questioned their age. For some reason, I always assumed they were like in their mid to late 20s, maybe early 30s at the oldest. I don't know why. It must be something in the behavior, or maybe I'm just projecting a little bit my own age, but for me, that part was clear. And as for the relationship, I get the sense that they're best friends. Possibly they used to be college roommates before they graduated and moved on. I didn't get the romantic sense, and it's because of the other thing. So Gerald said that, you know, she was there in the end, but to me, she wasn't there in the end, because that's why the sick friend ended up storming off into the closet, because she wants her there in the end. She wants her to hold vigil, and the narrator can't handle it. And people have different things they can handle. People have different levels of grief. But I feel like if they were romantic lovers, then she would have stayed through till the end.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you said that you felt like they were in their late 20s, because originally that was my thought originally. But then as the story went on, I realized that they were significantly older than that. And I think it was the voice of the narrator, really. Though I felt like the voice of the narrator was young. It didn't sound like an older female voice.
That's interesting. The voice sounded really young to me too, like unquestionably. Yeah. So partially in the way that we were talking about how she reflects the guilt, like everything, because like all these things that are going on, you're kind of seeing it through the narrator's emotional arc, which makes sense. She's a protagonist, the point of view character. But like the first time the nurse walks in, right in the beginning, she's assuming that this nurse is judging her for not being there, and that she and her best friend and the nurse are actually closer than she is with the best friend because of the guilt. It's this very kind of like self-centered way of looking at the world that I think we've kind of been conditioned to
assume is a younger voice.
Is a young voice.
Yeah, you know, and it's funny because as someone like Gerald who's been through something similar, you know, I feel like that's a very natural response, especially if it's the first friend that's died like this, you know. When you're much older and you've gone through half of your friends dying, I think there's a lot less of that, you know, just from having watched my mom, you know, getting those phone calls. But I feel like the first time you watch a friend die, there's a lot of guilt and there's a lot of confusion because you want to be there, but you don't necessarily know how to be there. You can't necessarily be there. You know, she may have had to leave because of work. You know, we don't know why she had to leave, but she had to leave. And that is difficult to leave someone when you know they're dying. It's not a good place to be, and I felt like that part of the emotion was really well expressed, and her conflict was really well expressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she was definitely conflicted because she hadn't been to see her, and it had taken her a long time to come and see her. So, you know, she felt bad about that, and obviously having to leave or wanting to leave, perhaps. You know, also had that same effect. I think that she would have she would have thought that she was deserting her friend. So maybe her friend thought, you know, I've spent this time with my best friend. There's no point in hanging around now. Perhaps that's what she thought.
Yeah. We really don't know. One thing I find interesting is how we're all feeling differently about this. Anais, when you wrote the summary, I told you I had to chuckle a little bit because your feelings about the narrator were showing up in the summary. And I thought that was really interesting because in one particular part of the summary, you said that she left and then she dreamt about going to the beach. Well, actually, she dreamt about going to the beach before she left. And I found that interesting that when you're reading the story, your own emotions, your own experiences really do color how you see the narrator. And I like stories like that. Because I think it tells a lot more about the reader necessarily than the narrator. Like when I read this story, I had very different emotions coming up, and I realized they were coming up because I'd been through something similar. And it was a very introspective reading experience for me. And I like that, you know, because it wasn't just telling, it was like I was involved in the story in some way.
Yeah, though I think there's two beach things, right? In the story, she actually does physically go to the beach while the good doctor is helping her friend. I guess it must be some treatment that's kind of grisly to watch. So they say, okay, can you leave for like an hour and come back? And then that's when the bed's there, and they take a nap. She wakes up, and she says, I need to leave. And then, then she's in the car, right? Like it's like a coastal highway thing. She's like driving.
She's dreaming about it. She's dreaming about it.
Like daydreaming about it, exactly. Yeah.
But that's before she actually says, I have to go home.
Oh, I thought it was after.
No, it's before. And I find that interesting, you know, because it tells me that she drew you into the story, you know, in that on that deep of a level, which isn't necessarily something a lot of writers do. I feel like a lot of writers, they go so far when you're talking about really, really painful subjects. They get you right up to the edge, and then they let you off the hook. They give you enough distance, but she doesn't really give you that distance. She keeps you there. You know, she didn't let you off the hook and give you enough distance to be able to look at the story from the outside. Instead, she drew you right in there and forced you to look at it from the inside so that your own emotions were coloring the story. And I love that. I really, really love that. And I wish I got that experience more often. Like when I sit back and I think about the amount of short stories that have done that for me, there aren't very many.
Yeah,
I think
Sorry, Anais.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think you're right, because I just looked at the story really quick, and you're right. She daydreams about it before she actually leaves the hospital, but it was so vivid that for me it was a foregone conclusion. She's going to leave. She's going to go and eat shrimp and have drinks in Malibu.
Yeah, that is just an author just messing with you.
Yeah,
I love it.
Tricked me, Hempel. Well, it tricked me, but like you made this so vivid that there's no other way it could pan out for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think she that's the sign of a good author, because she tells the story. It is a she, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
She tells a story, but what you're saying earlier, you're allowed to project your own feelings and your own experiences into the story as well. So when you say that Anais's summary was coloured by her own experiences, and I think it was a sort of a masterful piece of writing to not give you all the information. There's enough information to tell the story and to carry the story on, but you're sort of interpreting. It's like listening to a play on a radio or something, that you're picturing the characters and where they are and all this sort of thing. So I think it's the same sort of thing with a story like this.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about Nabokovian versus Bartlett's reading, and I feel like a lot of times when we look back on stories and when we discuss the stories, that's when the interpretation comes in. That's when we get involved on a personal level with the story. And I felt like with this story, it was happening as you were reading it, and that's what made it so amazing to me. Now, Gerald, you mentioned that you felt that you liked the story, but there were parts that you were conflicted about or maybe didn't like as much. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm sort of I'm reviewing that now because while we're discussing it, I'm thinking actually I think I would have liked the setting stated up front a little bit more obviously. I like the fact that not everything was explicitly described, but I think it's I don't know, maybe there was just a little too much vagueness in the early stages. So I couldn't place the relationship, I couldn't place the age, I didn't know what was wrong with the sick friend, and she talked about masks, and I'm thinking, are both of them ill, or is just one of them ill? So I couldn't really sort of get a handle on that. So I think I would have liked just a tiny little bit of information, so I could say, right, I'm settled in this. I can picture it in my head, rather than have it all sort of everything floating around. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, for me, I felt like it was very specific, but it might have been so specific that it actually left it vague. And let me see how I can explain this. Like, instead of saying she's sick with cancer, she says in the beginning that they both have masks on, and then later on that she's in the isolation ward, which leads you to that conclusion. But you have to do the work to get to that conclusion. And if those thoughts aren't in the back of your mind, you may not come to that conclusion. Or like the setting, rather than saying she's in a hospital, she's in this hospital, instead she's very specific about the palm trees, and next door is the Palm Royale, and across the street is the beach. Like, those are very specific. I instantly was able to place it, but I'm from California, and I've seen those locations on TV, even though I haven't been to LA very often. I think I've been there twice. Like, to me, that's a very specific location, whereas if you're not from that area, or if you don't have those necessary background facts, you wouldn't necessarily place it to that location. You know what I mean? It was instead of being blunt, she described things with such detailed facts, and if you don't know what those detailed facts are referring to, then it's going to remain vague for you. This story did expect the reader to have a certain level of knowledge and fluency. How about?
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm a bit more like Gerald in my interpretation of like the imagery and the setting, because the first time I read it, I think one of the bigger frustrations I had as I read it was I was like, just give me one sentence describing where we are right now. And the only place where she really describes everything is when she's actually at the beach and when she's dreaming about Malibu. That's the only time where you get really, really vivid descriptions of what's going on, that I'm starting to wonder if it was on purpose, because everything that's grisly, gray, dull, on death's, doormat is not described at all. And is it because the narrator's checking out? And then when she's at the beach, now she's more focused. When she's dreaming of Malibu, now she's more focused. So maybe it's because of the character that we're seeing it through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say the beach, this is just an aside, but for some reason in my head, from the description, I got the sand. It looked like Cheetos dust to me. It looked like really orange.
That's funny. Yeah, I didn't think about it that way, but I think you're onto something, because, in my experience being in that hospital room, you're not seeing details. Everything is confusing. You're just feeling lost. And getting that from the narrator's voice, I felt, was what allowed me to feel connected to the story and what made it feel so honest. I think would have been able to do all those details and stuff. It would have changed her character. It would have said that this character had a certain level of emotional distance during this experience, and she couldn't have that level of emotional distance until she physically was distanced. And it's just like, you leave the hospital, you get in the car, and that's when you cry. You don't cry in the hospital room because you're too just in shock. But you leave, and that's when you reflect, and that's when it hits you, and that's when the reality just gets to be too much, and you're finally able to let go a little bit. And so, yeah, that's an interesting point, Anais.
And I was just thinking as you were talking, because you were mentioning before the specifics within the hospital room, the specifics also tend to be the stuff that a healthy person who's never dealt with this before would notice, like the fact that she's become so good at wearing the mask that she only ties the top one, or when she...
I love that! Mm-hmm. I love that!
Right. And it's the stuff that only a healthy person who's never been there before would kind of think about, like, oh, or like when she sees the leg and then she says it calls to mind where there must be two people with the body at all time. Like, that was very graphic for me. And that's something you would, notice when you're there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I think also one of the things I perhaps thought could have been done better was, or maybe that's because I was going to say because there's very little emotional attachment to the friend. It's all sort of one way, but then maybe that's what she's trying to say, because the friend, the narrator, is just doing what her friend wants her to do, giving her information, giving her useless facts that she doesn't need to remember, and I was thinking, because thinking back to my experience of watching somebody in the hospital, I sort of so focused on the person and the tubes and you sort of, you don't see anything else. I wouldn't have noticed whether it was a camera or not, but you're so focused on person, and I thought that maybe a bit more. I'm not explaining this very well. I'm out of practice, aren't I? A bit more sort of information from the sick person about her responses, about her glances, her looking this way. But maybe that's because she's saying, there's this person dying. It's just a person dying, and the friend, the narrator, is there to give the information, to talk, and just to be there. So maybe that was very clever, and I'm just missing it.
Well, I think there's a difference between having it be clever and missing it, versus having it be clever and just having it not be the story that you necessarily needed. I feel like that was very purposefully done. That doesn't mean that you're going to enjoy it anymore, and it doesn't mean that you're wrong for not enjoying that part. I think that's a very natural reaction that, someone reading this could say, I want to hear more about the sick person. I want to get more from the relationship. But I do feel like the story wasn't necessarily about the relationship. I feel like the story was about the experience of watching someone die, which is a different story.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys read the introduction that Amy Hempel, the author, wrote to the story for Fictionaut?
No, I didn't.
So in the introduction, she explains this is her first short story ever, and she wrote it in the early 80s, I think in 83, when she was still a student at Columbia.
Oh, so
And
they would have been in their 20s.
that's what I'm saying. So I might be another reason
Yeah.
why I'm so sure of it, because it's a real story. Like they had to write about something. I think the assignment was like write about something that you don't want to tell anyone or that you're ashamed of or something you don't want to look back at. So then she wrote this, and when they wanted to publish it, she ended up writing her late friend's mother saying, "Do you think this is exploitative? Is this okay?" And then the mother okayed it. So
Yeah,
I feel like this is one of those stories where you know how some people are like, oh, death to the author. You can do that to a certain extent,
no.
but you can't really fully.
No,
do it.
you can't, because watching someone die at 30 is very different than watching someone die at 60. And that really does, explain why it felt like a young voice, because it was a young voice.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's interesting, because I didn't look that up, and it really does affect how you see the story. Like you said, death to the author doesn't necessarily work, because I was reading this as a total tabula rasa, death to the author situation, and hearing what year this was written does change how I see the story now.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because it doesn't sound like a story from that era.
No, it doesn't. It sounds like a
story.
It sounds like early thousands. Not quite 90s, but it definitely sounds like a much more modern story.
It's because of that sort of like clipped rhythm.
Yeah.
The clipped rhythm, the amount of detail. I feel like earlier writings in the 80s it still had a lot more of the exposition, and there was more more description in the books that I was reading back then. But what was I reading back then, really?
Yeah, I mean,
I was reading fantasy and porn for mothers. My mother's huge collection of Harlequin romance books and Roger Zelazny. Like, that's what I was reading.
Oh, we were talking about porn.
Mommy porn.
Whoa, that's a completely different subject here.
And now we get our rating.
Yeah.
Sorry, we were so good last week.
Yes, I've come back and ruined it all. I just want to come back on something you said, Maya, when you said watching somebody die in the 20s, 30s is very different than watching somebody die in their later years. And I don't think it is. I think it all depends on your relationship to the person that's dying, which I think comes back on my desire to see more emotional input from the sick friend, and I think because it means if the closer you are to the person, you're watching this person leave, and it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter whether they're young or old, because you're so involved in the relationship and the impending ending of that relationship. I think it's the same.
I think it's just as hard, but I think it's different. I know that when I watched my mother go through watching people die, including her own kids, the pain was the level of pain was still excruciating, but there was also a hint of I've been through this before, and inevitability and almost resignation in her that I don't see younger people have when they watch someone die. There's a sense of, oh my God, how can this happen? This isn't fair. And whereas I would never have seen that from my mother. When my brother died, there was this inevitable crap. Shit like this just happens because life is horrible and God hates me. That's the sense I got from my mother. Whereas when I watched my mom die, there was there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot more confusion. There was the lack of acceptance lasted longer. And it colored my world in a way that if I watch a person die now, having been through that experience once before, colors my world in a way that I would experience it much more differently now.
Yeah, I think as a young person.
Come on, young person.
Yeah, rub it in.
Yeah, we've got all 3 generations going on here.
All 3, yeah. I think there's I think I fall somewhere in the middle of your opinions. I think there's some truth to both of it. I think there's something about young people that when you're dealing with something like this, something so heavy, there's something about at least my generation, and I think it's always been this way for 20-year-olds, where being very, very vulnerable by letting yourself openly in front of other people experience this and having that be shown is very difficult. So I don't think it's that young people don't feel it. I think they just kind of like bottling it up. It sounds a little cliche. It's just kind of like there's this aversion to vulnerability.
Save it for later.
Yeah, that I think with age you realize it doesn't matter. Everyone right now is depressed. You can let it go, and then it allows you to be a more nurturing, caring person. Because this narrator clearly loves her friend, is clearly grieving. She just doesn't know how to be there, really. She doesn't know how to nurture and how to let herself be vulnerable in order to give herself in a brave way. That I think older people have more practice with that. And I think it's especially true of kind of like really intelligent, brainy, analytical people, because I've seen this in my friends that are very analytical. Like one of my closest friends right now, she's, you know, her mother's, you know, dealing with cancer. The whole family's dealing with this, and we talk a lot about my friend's feelings. And the biggest thing for her is just, you know, she's, of course she cares, but it's just sort of like showing that she can't let herself be vulnerable, even though it's wrecking her inside, right? But I think once there's a death of somebody very close to you, like Gerald was saying, there comes a point though where that resistance, I think, gets broken.
Yeah, I once you say that, it definitely strikes me as something that feels very true to me, you know, because even as I was crying, my daughter did not cry probably for 3 weeks, you know, and she was young. You would think that a really, really young kid would be a mess, but she was standing next to grandma and they're blank face, just watching everything. I know that every detail in that room is probably seared in her memory in a way that wasn't necessarily for me, because I was much more focused on mom. And my experience was very different from my mother's natural children because they were all significantly older. And so it was really interesting to see, you know, if I look back to that scene, 3 different generations, and all 3 were very different experiences. You know, my experience was very different compared to, you know, her other kids that were in the room. And I think a large part of it was just due to age, and my daughter's experience was very different from mine.
Ooh. There you go.
So I have a question about the title. So I looked up who Al Jolson is.
I knew you would. I was like, oh, I should look that up. Nah, good. I actually thought that. That's funny.
So he was a singer, actor, and comedian, American singer, actor, and comedian who predates rock and roll. They call him, in retrospect, the Elvis of ragtime, jazz, and blues. But here's the thing. You know, whenever there's like a think piece talking about like the history of blackface, and you see that old-timey black and white guy with the really shiny face, it's Al Jolson. It's this guy. So I can't help but wonder if there's some commentary about like fraud or putting on appearances or wearing a mask that's you know, that's not okay to this story. Like, why would you pick this guy who by the 80s, that, you know, the narrative that that's not okay has already come up, especially for somebody in Colombia.
I wish I could be that clever with my titles. My titles are not that deep. I'm just like, what the hell do I name this story? I'll just name it that.
Yeah. I just feel like Amy Hempel, young student in Colombia, is not missing the whole blackface narrative happening here with Al Jolson. That didn't go over her head, you know?
No, I think you're right. I think that there's definitely a message in the title. And, and of course, it was you to point it out.
I can't believe she said I had to look up Al Jolson.
No, really, I literally 24 hours ago, I was like, oh, I should look up who Al Jolson is. Nah, Anais will do it.
So you didn't know who he was either?
No, I didn't know who he was either.
Jeez, I am so old. Oh.
No. There's a difference. Baby boomer, Generation X, millennial. We got all 3 generations. It's okay. Hey, what did I say? Intel machine.
Yeah,
went right over Anais's head.
But Yeah, I think it is, it's an interesting title because it only comes in right at the end, and yeah, you might have a point that she was she was, well, was she being false with her friendship? We
I
don't know,
don't
do
think
we?
she was being false, but I think that she was holding her emotions tight and behind a mask, and that once her friend died, she buried that mask, and now she's able to express those feelings. Like, it's
Mm,
very symbolic. Once Annie says, I'm like, oh, duh.
yep.
And there's even
Yeah.
that line, which I think was my favorite, where she says, I don't know why looking back should show us more than looking at. So I think there's also
Hmm.
this sense of like at the time somehow like I think for me there's a undercurrent to this whole story of guilt of like I didn't really handle this the best way that I should have. And I was putting on some front for myself to protect myself from this thing that I couldn't really deal with. And looking back at it now, you have that kind of heartbreaking story of the gorilla. And I think she's like, it's okay to kind of get down to that kind of primal level of I just miss and this is horrible.
Yeah. Whereas for me, I see the same thing, but I don't see it as guilt. I see it as a very natural recognition and exploration of the fact that when you're in the middle of something really traumatic, you don't necessarily see all the details until you stand back, until after it's over and you write about it. They say that even about writing memoir. They say, if you're going to write a memoir, you need to wait a little bit after whatever events occurred that you're going to be writing about so that you can see them more clearly. Because if you write them too soon afterwards, it comes off like it comes off really sophomoric and like all caught up in yourself in the writing. Like, that's the big complaint about young memoirists, is that a lot of times the writing is very self-absorbed. But I don't think it's because they're self-absorbed people. I think it's because it's so close to the time, that those events occurred. And then, 2, 3, 4 years later, you look back at those events in a very different way.
Yes, it's interesting. I'm just looking back at the story now, and the line after Anais's favourite line about looking back and looking at, and it says,
It's a great line.
yeah, and it says, it is just possible I will say I stayed the night, and who is there that can say I did not? So she's obviously thinking there that of the guilt that
Hmm.
she feels she should have stayed the night, but she didn't, but she's covering up that guilt um, by telling lies.
Which everybody does.
Mm.
Yeah.
Judgment time, just because I'm curious. So with the caveat that everyone grieves the way that they will, that her reaction is also very normal and natural, all of that, should she have stayed, or was it perfectly fine for her to leave?
I don't think she could have.
You don't think she could have?
I think, everybody, sometimes staying is the worst thing you can do if you can't hold it together.
Mm.
If I'm dying and I want somebody there with me and they can do that, great. That's going to be a huge support to me. But if they literally can't, if them staying, it means me spending 16 hours watching my friend fall apart, don't frickin' stay. Tell me you can't stay and go. And so I don't think, like, given her reaction, given how much she was holding it together, I think staying possibly would have ended up being worse for her friend. Because eventually that curtain's got to come down. You can only hold that up for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the fact that she hadn't been before, and it had taken her a long time to come and see her friend, and the paragraph where she says, I have to go home, about her, she was wringing out hands and all this sort of stuff. I felt weak and small and failed, also exhilarated. And then she goes on to talk about what she's going to do. She's going to drive down the coast highway and
Fast.
Malibu, and, yeah.
Which really said a lot to me, because I actually did that. I should have gotten a ticket. You got to take out all that emotion on something. Yeah. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. No, I'd sort of finished anyway.
Yeah, that line stood out to me a lot because of how she said, I'm going to leave and I'm going to drive fast. I was like, that is a natural freaking emotion. Like, she's going to push that pedal until someone pulls her over. Yeah. How about you, Anais? I feel like you probably did have a little bit more judgment.
I think a little bit. I think I waffle because I think okay, yes. If staying would mean that she then needs to go see a psychologist and a therapist because she's going to be wrecked for the rest of her life, then just leave. But there's also a part of me that's like, sometimes you have to do stuff that you don't want to do. That's hard for other people because they at that moment have it worse and their need is greater than yours. So I don't know how it would be for this person. And if she really, really, really is going to be, affected by this in a way where she's going to need additional help to after this, then okay, she should go. But there's a part of me that's like, I don't know where that is. Like,
but what if it's not about her? What if this happened to you and you're in this room and you know that you're literally just gonna sit there and cry all night next to your friend?
I know, you have to make this weird, tough judgment.
Like, quite frankly, yeah. I've heard from people that were dying that literally, like, there was just a letter in the newspaper. It was like a Dear Abby type thing, but it's not Abby. It's on Slate. Who's that lady on Slate that does the thing that's like Dear Abby? Well, she got a letter that was like, the letter came from someone who's dying, who said that they had seen someone die, and everyone was falling apart, and because of that, they weren't sure whether to tell their friends that they were dying. Because of that, and the journalist went on to talk about how, she's seen that happen and how you should tell your friends, but only if you have someone there as a buffer, because watching your friends fall apart is not helpful as you're dying. And you need to have somebody in that room to say, okay, you can leave. She really just needs, like, calm people in here right now. Yeah. And, because I had literally just read that, like, just a few days ago, maybe I have a slightly different feeling on this, but also I remember watching my mom die, and I know that if I had fallen apart in that room, my mom would not have had an easy death. Like, that would have made her death 10 times harder. So for me, I'm looking at this young person who's already not dealing. Like, you can tell, like, she's, like, at her limit. She's going to fall apart soon. To me, telling that person to stay in that room doesn't help the person who's dying any at all.
Yeah.
The person who's dying may think they want them there, but the minute, 16 hours later of watching your friend die, and you really wish they would just frickin' leave because you need to die in peace, and this is making your work. That's not the last thing you want to see as you're dying.
Yeah. I mean, you're definitely, like, the advice and your opinion's definitely, like, not something that I disagree with. I think there's just a part of me that, like, when I'm reading the story and the friend...
You don't have to agree with me. We can argue. Let's argue. Let's roll.
Like, I don't want to take the opposite position too hard, because at the end of the day, if you can't deal with something, okay. And you're right that it's not helpful for the dying person either to see their loved ones fall apart. But I guess as I was reading this story, like, the sick friend gets so upset by this. She asks for a bed to come in, and she gets so upset by it that she actually, like, storms out even though she can't breathe, and she, like, wobbles over to the closet. And it's like, seeing that, like, there's a part of me
it was like, heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking. It's like, girl, how does that not make you stay? Like, how could, even if in the final moments, maybe the friend says you don't have to be here for the final breaths, or in the final moments you're like...
I think Anais just froze. I actually think, for me, that would make it even more important for me to leave, because, like, I think I would fall apart even more. I don't think I would be in one piece after watching my friend literally get up and run out of the room and be falling apart like that. I think that would crush me. And I think, even though for me the narrator has no reason to feel any guilt, I feel like at that point then I would start to feel guilt. I would have, like, this overwhelming sense of guilt because I'm unable to handle this, which is just a horrific... I can't imagine how horrific an experience that has to be, and how many years of processing that it would take to get over it. Because watching your friend, like, she literally fell apart and ran out of that room like that. And the nurses are all comforting her, and she's just standing back watching this. I don't know how long it would take for me to be able to process that.
Yeah, I think in a way, I feel that the sick friend was perhaps being a little bit selfish, because her friend had. I would like to think that if I was in that situation and my friend had come to see me and they said I have to go, I would say thank you so much. I'd like to think that I would say, oh, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. No, it's fine. And after they'd gone, I would
Fall
do
apart.
something. Yeah. So but it's easy to sit here and say
Yeah.
that.
I think, given the age of the person dying, I think there was probably a lot of fear of dying alone,
Yeah, true.
wow. And to have somebody there, your best friend there, is probably like the only thing she's been probably wanting for weeks. I mean, it's obvious that her friend hasn't come, and then she's finally there. Please don't leave me. I'm sure there was a lot of that. I just can't imagine being in that position.
Yeah, and I mean, also, if you're going to give a free pass to people who are dealing with the death of somebody that they love, as they should, because
I think we should give a free pass to the people dying.
Yeah. The person on their deathbed gets a free pass. They can also do whatever they want. Yeah. Yeah. Rating time?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a rough story for me. It was a pretty deep, emotional story, and I gotta give props for being so honest and open in the story. I think it's so easy as an author when you're tackling a tough subject to back off, and the fact that the story doesn't back off just makes me respect this author so much. I definitely want to read more of her work. Is Gerald frozen?
No. I thought Annie said we were going to rate.
Oh, well, she was frozen when she said that, so I didn't hear that. Okay, so let's rate. It's okay. It all comes out in post, right?
Yeah.
Thank goodness for post.
I'll go first. I was gonna give it 4.5, but on reflection, it's and on after discussion, I think it's better than 4.5. So it's a 5 from me. It would have been higher if for this little bit of information at the start that I felt I needed. But yeah, 5 for me.
For me, it's funny. I'm giving it a 4.5. To me, that's a really good story. Should I give it a 5? I feel like this is a 4.5 story for me, and I don't know why. I can't say why it's not a 5 for me. That's odd, but it's a 4.5, and I love the story, but I consider a 4.5 really high praise. So maybe my 4.5 is different than your 4.5, but for some reason I feel like I should give it a 5, but in my gut I'm saying it's a 4.5 story.
Yeah, when I first read it, I was going to give it a 4.5. I feel like we're all kind of the same here. But then after this conversation, when I realized, oh, she's doing things on purpose with the imagery, then I said, you know what, 5.
I love this story. Why am I the only one not giving it a 5?
I think it's because the theme is, you've read a lot about it, so it feels a little overplayed.
But I don't feel like, I actually feel like this is a very novel story for the subject matter. I really respect the fact that it's a similar theme, but it's a theme that's been done in a way that I haven't seen, and it's done really well. It's done really, really well. And I think back, I'm like, what would I have liked to see more? And I can't put my finger on it, but I feel like there's something missing there for me, and I just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Okay. 4.5 it is.
Okay. So let's talk about last week's rating. So listeners gave The Servant's Daughter, a well-known Chinese parable made even more famous by Paulo Coelho, 2.75 Bradberries.
And might I say, your mama was on my side of the fence. She liked that story. So there, booyah.
You can have her.
I can't wait to listen to
You got Todd, but I got your mama.
Todd and I, birds of a feather.
That's okay, because your mom's a genius. Geniuses stick together.
Do you hear that, Todd? Okay. So let's choose next week's story. I'm hosting the game because I love hosting the game. But first, what stories do you want to read?
Gerald, since you haven't been here for a while.
Ooh. Well, I'm dipping back into Carve magazine again, the magazine named after Raymond Carver. And the story I want to nominate is Safe Somewhere by Baird Harper.
And the story that I am submitting, I submitted last week, but I am determined that we are going to read a Zadie Smith story eventually. I am submitting Embassy of Cambodia in the New York Times.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me, the New Yorker. Bad, Maya. That was bad. That was really bad.
Shame.
Okay, so the game that we're playing is a nod to all those kind of random facts and anecdotes that the narrator told the sick friend.
Annie
so what I'm
hates
going to do... No, I don't. I made this really easy, 50-50 every question. Because what I'm
You say that every time.
Every time it's true.
Except for me.
No, this is true. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say an outlandish fact, and you have to tell me if it's true or false.
Oh, fun!
Yeah.
Wow.
So Gerald's going to go first because...
Again.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you leave.
Yeah, I'm never going on holiday again.
Okay, so Gerald.
Yo.
Anne Frank, Martin Luther King Jr., and Barbara Walters were all born in the same year, 1929. True or false?
No, that's false.
It's true.
No.
Yeah. Isn't
Whoa.
that crazy? What a good year.
Okay.
Okay. Maya.
Barbara Walters looks good.
I know, right? Yeah.
I want to age like that.
Okay, so Maine is the closest U.S. state to Africa.
False.
Also true. They're outlandish facts, guys.
Really?
Gerald.
Yo.
She's killing us here.
Oh.
Cleopatra lived closer to the invention of the iPhone than the building of the Great Pyramids.
That's true.
It is
Ooh.
true.
Ooh.
Maya, the name Jessica was invented by Shakespeare.
False.
It's true. In the Merchant of Venice. I know. Lots of truths. Gotta throw you in for a loop.
Yeah.
Gerald, hippo milk is green.
Now I actually know this. What?
And how do you know this?
I'd rather not go into it at this stage. Hippo milk is green. No, that's a false one.
It is false. It's actually pink.
What?
Yes.
Obviously.
Of course, it's pink. What?
Yeah.
Of course. Everyone knows that.
I want to know if it's like pale pink or is it like bright neon pink?
It's pretty bright. I saw a picture of it while doing this.
Oh, that's disgusting.
Oh, dear.
It kind of looks like, you know, the antibiotic they give children. The
Ew!
Yeah.
Move on.
Pepto-Bismol milk. Okay, move on. Nothing to see here.
Maya, Cookie Monster is allergic to peanuts.
True.
It's false, but his
What?
name is Sid.
I didn't know his name was Sid.
I know. I made.
I feel like I should have known that.
Gerald,
Yes.
Russia has a larger surface area than Pluto.
Oh. Oh.
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a good one. No, that's false.
It's true.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say that was true.
I can see Russia from my Pluto.
Oh, jeez.
I love you, Anais.
What's been going on while I was away?
Nothing nearly this goofy. We only get goofy for you.
Maya, Betty White's father invented sliced bread.
True.
No, it's false. And it's impossible because Betty White is older than sliced bread.
Really?
Yeah, apparently.
She looks amazing.
I know. Gerald, this one now goes back to the story. It's about flamingos because the story had the thing about shrimp making flamingos pink.
Mm-hmm.
There are more fake flamingos in the world than there are real flamingos.
Flamingos. We don't have any here, but then you probably got a lot over in America. So I will say true.
It's true.
You don't have fake flamingos in Europe?
No, sorry.
Okay, so I had a tiebreaker question, which we don't need because, sorry.
But I want to know now.
This fact is amazing. So the last time the Chicago Cubs won a baseball World Series, the Ottoman Empire still existed.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Unbelievable facts.
I spent some time in Chicago, and it's I went to watch a few Cubs games. That's a bit. I have an affinity with them.
I had to say baseball World Series so that in case they're listening, they remember what baseball or the World Series.
Yeah, that could be confusing. Which World Series?
Yes, World Series of America. Yeah.
So, Gerald, what story are we reading next week?
We are reading Safe Somewhere by Baird Harper.
Okay, and I look forward to that because Carve Magazine seems to have really good stuff.
I hope so.
So, yep. So, I need a gorilla to teach me how to sign. Listeners, come comment. Listeners, visit us because the discussion does not end here. Join the discussion at literaryroadhouse.com, and while you're at it, leave an iTunes, Stitcher. I'll do it again later. While you're at it, leave an iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker review. But most important of all, don't forget to tell your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
Okay, now you can reread it because that was really funny.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. Okay. I need a gorilla to teach me how to sign. Listeners, come comment. Listeners, visit us because the discussion does not end here. Join the discussion at literaryroadhouse.com. And while you're at it, leave an iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker review. But most important of all, don't forget to tell your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
We did it!
Very good.
Do you realize we've almost been doing this a half a year?
I know.
No.